I was concerned. I thought, okay, he's standing up with his cane. Are we going to get into a brawl?
He came there to declare himself the conquering hero and not simply to swat the Democratic fly, but to grind it into the carpet.
65% of independent voters say that we're drifting apart, and 78% of Democrats, that's no surprise, only 10% of Democrats think the nation is coming together. So that this is all over the place.
There wasn't an ounce of humanity on the Democratic side, as well as an ounce of being an opposition party that meant anything to the American people.
This is the youngest portion of the electorate, and among them, it's 41% who say secession is likely at some point in the future.
It's Friday, and it means another edition of Real Polling in Real Time with Zogby. That's us. I'm John Zogby, my son and managing partner of the company, Jeremy Zogby. How you doing this week?
Hey, I'm doing good, and I'm looking forward to this very timely, very important podcast, which will dive into the data and some insights on.
Yeah, and importantly, this is our second podcast this week. We did one on Monday because we had brand new, fresh numbers from the weekend. And then obviously the president delivered a major and quite long State of the Union message on Tuesday, and we have some numbers that are relevant to that. So just for our listeners and viewers, these are the segments today. So number one, we're going to take a look at that State of the Union message and recap it, some of the brighter moments and some of the very tense moments. We're going to refer to our poll against the backdrop of the State of the Union by reviewing a question that we asked: are Americans coming together or are they drifting apart? We have a new look at the data, and it's pretty astounding. We will revisit voters' perception of how likely secession is. You know, it's only been in the last decade and a half that term has kind of entered the lexicon or the vocabulary of Americans. And is it alive and fresh among some? And then what we'll do is we'll take a look at the State of the Union and the state of the nation. What did it all mean, and what are the ramifications for us? And then, of course, at the end, we will tell you how you can get in touch with us, because we love to hear your comments, and we'll tell you also about some other things about what we're doing. But Jer, why don't we start now? Why don't you begin with a brief recap of the State of the Union message? I'll jump in as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you can analyze this from obviously what was said, but also what was witnessed visually in terms of what we saw. And, you know, my interpretation of it, immediately I was struck by the long entrance. I mean, I don't think that's too uncharacteristic, although this one seemed a little bit longer, and the long ovation from the right side of the chamber, and what appeared obvious to me instantly was the coldness from the Democrats. None of this is necessarily new, but when you kind of go into some further detail, I had some concerning thoughts. The long ovation and the taunting to the Democrats, basically communicating, "You're losers, sit down, shut up, you know, you failed," and of course arrogance on the side of the Democrats. But no sooner than the start of this Trump speech and the taunting from the Republicans, we saw Representative Al Green standing up, defying and holding a cane. And to me, you know, one with an eye to symbolism, that cane had some very symbolic gesture to it. Of course, I'm talking about the famous incident in 1856 and the Charles Sumner caning. Now, in this age of reality TV, where reality and television, the lines are blurred, I was concerned. I thought, okay, he's standing up with his cane. Are we going to get into a brawl? It's certainly there was enough tension. But anyway, the speech went on. Representative Green was removed from the spectacle, from the event, and and really it just more or less devolved. I mean, look, Trump and the Republicans are dominating. They're winning big, but they were showboating and they were using every chance to show that they were winning. And that's my basic synopsis. And so that's why I think it's important to get to some of these questions about coming together, drifting apart, and secession, which we'll do in a couple of minutes. But what about you?
All right,
How
mine,
did you interpret everything?
mine mirrors your thoughts, and I think we'll also set the table for the data that we have. But the president clearly did not go to Congress with an olive branch at all. He came there to declare himself the conquering hero, and not simply to swat the Democratic fly, but to grind it into the carpet. And I think as you looked at the Democrats and their silly little pop-up signs and the looks on their faces of total defeat, and then even I have to say the contempt that they showed. For example, I noticed Representative Debbie Dingell, who I happen to like, in Michigan. They swung over for a nanosecond to her face while that little boy from New York who wanted to be a police officer was being honored by the Secret Service, and she rolled her eyes and shook her head. And so Trump won, and he was there to declare victory. And then it was in your face. Talking about some of the foreign aid um, items that he cut, emphasizing the ridiculous, talking about Social Security and the waste in Social Security, and actually making a mockery out of a few of the items, like that there are Americans between 200 and 220 years of age who are getting Social Security. Fact checkers clarified that the next day, but it looked bad. And he had his moment. But the thing is, having his moment, what's he presiding over? And that's what we're going to talk about right now. This is a broken nation, I think, or at least a broken government. So why don't you start us off with your first polling item that's relevant?
Yeah. So the key question, are Americans coming together or are they drifting apart, is pretty startling. We have here 59% overall. That's 3/5 of the country say that Americans are drifting apart. A quarter say that the country's coming together. 16% say they're undecided. But where is the lion's share fall in terms of those who think the country is coming together or drifting apart? I think the view of party is very telling, that Republicans are actually more or less split. It's understandable that the Republican Party, as the victors, as we've talked about, victors in terms of the 24 election and the first 40 days in office, 44% think the country's coming together, 37% think it's drifting apart. That 37%, I think, are more realistic and grounded in what the president faces. I do want to note that I understand, putting myself in the shoes of President Trump, if anybody withstood what he did in terms of attack, it is quite natural to come back and brag about a victory. That's understandable. Although it it is worrisome in terms of what it can do in terms of further tearing the country apart. But independents, 65% of them, and this is key, 65% of independent voters say that we're drifting apart, and 78% of Democrats, that's no surprise, only 10% of Democrats think the nation is coming together. So that this is all over the place. The last number I'm going to show here, which I think drives it all home, is the demographic that looks at which type of media do you trust most. And I'm slicing this into legacy media versus new media, and we know what that is. But if you're a legacy media consumer, 64% of them say the nation is drifting apart. 22% say we're coming together. And if you're a new media follower, trustee, 36% say we're coming together, and less than half, 48%, say we're drifting apart. So all of this really comes down to not just partisan views, but how you consume your information and what you trust. And so what we have there is a very divided republic and public who are basically living in alternate realities. And so that's to set the stage for the bigger question. But why don't you chime in?
Yeah, let me jump in here because I don't want to relitigate the first Trump presidency, but I do want to clarify that even though I always felt that impeachment and two efforts at impeachment was a large political mistake, simply because the votes were never going to be there in the United States Senate to remove the president. There's no sense going through a show if you're not going to be able to deliver, and you're going to look bad in the process. So I criticize the Democrats for that. On the other hand, the court system, the president was reviewed and indicted by several grand juries for fixing the books in a civil case of sexual assault, of tampering with the elections, of actually attempting to denigrate the reputation by name of mother-daughter election workers in Georgia. I mean, there was smoke here, and for him to portray himself as a victim when there was so much smoke, I think is honestly a mischaracterization of those first 4 years. But let's move on. What else?
Well, I mean, this feeds into the next question, and before I get into the numbers on secession, look, we're having a conversation here with each other. The nation is having a conversation. I'm not taking a side, but what you just laid out in terms of what the president did that was wrong and illegal and unjust and worthy of facing a grand jury, and whether your opinion is that he should have been found guilty on something, we have to remember that the Biden administration is not without fault. And look, that's important, because that helps us understand how this is brewing and could potentially boil over if we only apply the scales of justice to one president and his party, but not the other president and his party. And we know, and I'm not going to get into the laundry list, but voters now know, a critical mass of voters now know, that the Biden administration was not without fault. The Biden administration was not without guilt. There is a major story that's coming out continuously, more and more, about who was running the White House, and the media that knew that Biden was not cognitively up for the job, yet he was presented as he was up for the job cognitively, but clearly he wasn't running the nation. And that was a major scandal, and there are other scandals. And so that...
And let that play out, Jared, but we're talking, and let that play out. For now, it's the president's State of the Union message, the conquering hero. But, as we're going to see here, there's some shattered glass that went along with that.
Absolutely. And I just felt it was necessary to lay out the other side. But I mean, look, we asked this question: how likely is it that a state or a group of states could leave the union and go on their own way? I wanted to boil it down in the most common, everyday man and woman's language. Go their own way, and in parentheses, otherwise known as secession. And so this is a Likert scale of likelihood: very likely, somewhat likely, not too likely, and not likely at all. And we don't ask this question necessarily to look to the overall result to tell us when or if this is going to happen. Actually, what we're doing is we're looking for the trend line, and I'll display that for you. So the top line data, 10% say very likely, 18% say somewhat. That's 28% who say that there's a degree of likelihood. That's over a quarter of Americans.
It's a high number.
What's that?
It's a high number.
It's a high number. It's not a number that makes you want to go to bed feeling good and sleeping well at night. But and then of course if we break it down by party, well let me tell you, not too likely. 58% say it's not likely in general, and so that's good, right? But when we look at party, actually, the parties are relatively in aligned in agreement. 22% of Democrats think it's likely. 26% of Republicans think it's likely, and 25% of independents say it's likely. So this is something that they agree on. They agree on that they're drifting apart. They agree on that there is this likelihood. But what I found more unnerving and more unsettling, and this is the last data point here, is when you look at age. And so when you look at age, start out on the oldest end, those older than 65, only 15% think it's likely. But then you go down to 18 to 29, and this is key because this is the future of the electorate. This is the youngest portion of the electorate, and among them, it's 41% who say secession is likely at some point in the future. That's huge. I want to get your reaction to that.
So, interestingly, because we've been asking this question, over the last decade or so, not that long ago, during the first Trump years and the early Biden years, the number who thought that secession was likely was in the high 30s, low 40s. So maybe we see some progress here. On the other hand, I want to use the word troublesome about 18 to 29-year-olds, but let's bump that down to concerning, because you're right. They will grow as part of the electorate. And with a baseline of 41% now, and we know a high level of distrust in government and political institutions, we don't want to be looking at a lost generation of real talent and real humanity that just doesn't see a future in government and politics. And this, I think, is what we're looking at when we look at the other question of Elon Musk and DOGE. It's one thing to identify waste in government. It's one thing to put people out and humiliate them by firing them. But it's also a signal to young people, not only a few opportunities in government, but perhaps just no future in government whatsoever, and who's actually going to pick up the pieces of whatever government is left.
Yeah, and I zeroed in on age for obvious reasons, that they're the notion of the youth or the future. But as we know very well, that this younger cohort is the most diverse in American history.
Yeah.
Not only just in terms of skin color, pigmentation, and ethnicity and culture, but also viewpoints, having been mostly or mainly a digital generation. They have probably been exposed to more before the age of 18 than any other generation in history just because of technology. But that ethnic and racial angle to their diverse nature makeup made me think of the race demographic here. And this is pretty staggering too, that when we break it down by white, Hispanic, and black, 21% of white voters think it's likely, yet 51% of Hispanics say it's likely. That's more than twice the amount of white voters who think secession is likely. And then when you look at the black vote, we're up to 39%.
Yeah.
And so not only is this a young old thing, it's also a white, non-white thing. And the implications of that are boundless, are plentiful, I should say. So why don't we leave it at that with the data, because I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on. Maybe we could just, come up with some more insights. What does this all mean? What to look for? Why it's important?
Okay, I'm going to take a different approach for me, and I'm going to at least give the president and Elon Musk some credit for starting a process that's long overdue. The federal government is too fat. It's unsustainable. It does not address the needs of a high-tech America and a high-tech savvy population. I think it's cruel and inhumane the way it's being done, but I think the door is open for the Democrats in an effort to save themselves as well as the country to begin the process of a more humane approach to eliminating federal jobs. Look, the federal government is too fat. It's unsustainable, and it's a terrible, terrible burden on taxpayers at every level. It needs to be modernized. Technology demands that it does. But by the same token, just as when industries, manufacturers have left communities, often in their wake, they have left with severance pay, retraining for a new economy, with courses and certifications at community colleges. What's the plan for federal workers who are getting the pink slips on a Friday and a terrible letter saying that their performance was the reason, when that's far from true? So I think if the Democrats are listening, instead of holding up those stupid signs that were embarrassing, get down to meeting with mayors at the local level, other frontline people, community college presidents, and a task force, and say, yes, this budget has to be cut. This government has to be reduced. Here's a much more humane alternative. I think that could revive this instead of complaining.
Yeah. Well, you bring up an interesting point on many levels. One that jumped out at me is, here we're talking about the division of this nation, to the point of talking about secession, and we're looking at age and race. But the other demographic that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room is those who work for the federal bureaucracy, or those whose businesses are dependent on the federal bureaucracy, versus everyone else.
Yeah.
And so if we could have weaved that into our survey to get that demographic to see this question, I think it would be even more revealing. But this is something, obviously, we're going to continue to look at in our polling. And this is the trend. This is a trend to follow. So we'll have more data.
Okay, absolutely. And so as we sign off, I will remind you once again of my book about how to read polling. Obviously, Jeremy and I spend an awful lot of our time doing that, but fascinating story. And my book tells some stories about the importance of polling and what it tells us. Secondly is the contact. If you need our services, then be sure to contact us, and also be sure to give us a review of our conversation, as some of you have from week to week. And so I thank you, and I'm signing off. Jared?
Yeah, for those who are watching, you're going to see the screen pop up how you can get in touch with us. For those who are listening, we encourage you to go to our site, johnsogbystrategies.com, hit the contact button, and you'll find our emails. Or if you want to see what we have to say on X or YouTube or Spotify or SoundCloud, you can find us there. You can find this podcast there. But specifically, to get our expert take, reach out, go into our website, johnsogbystrategies.com, and look for the emails.
Have a good week.
Have a great week.